Roy O. Disney visited his brother's hospital room on the afternoon of December 14th, 1966, and found him staring at the ceiling. Walt didn't say hello first. He pointed up. The tiles above the bed were standard acoustic panels, the perforated kind hospitals used everywhere in the 1960s, laid out in a grid. Walt had been looking at that grid for weeks by then, and somewhere in that time, it had stopped being a ceiling and become a map. He told Roy that every 4 tiles represented 1 square mile of the Florida property. He traced a line with his finger. "That's the highway," he said. "That's the monorail route." Then he stopped on 1 tile in particular, smiled, and said, "There, that's the spot." Roy asked him what he meant. Walt said that was where he and Lillian would put a bench, so the 2 of them could sit and watch the people come in. Roy went home that night and told his wife he thought Walt had a real chance of pulling through. The next morning, December 15th, at 9:30, Walt Disney died of acute circulatory collapse, a complication of the lung cancer surgery he'd had 5 weeks earlier. He was 65. He had turned 65 10 days before. The ceiling tile story gets repeated often enough that it's worth being honest about its shape. It comes from Roy, secondhand, and Roy told it more than once in more than one version over the years, which is normal for the last exchange a person has with a dying brother. Memory does something to those conversations, smooths them, gives them a punchline they may not have had in the room. But the broad strokes hold up across tellings. And the detail that doesn't get smoothed out is the part that matters here. 2 months before he died in a hospital bed with a diagnosis he wasn't fully told the truth about, Walt Disney's last coherent project wasn't a movie. It was a piece of land in Central Florida that didn't have a shovel in it yet. To understand why that's where his mind went, you have to go back 4 years to something that had nothing to do with theme parks. By 1962, Walt Disney was bored with Disneyland, or at least bored with the part of it he could still control. The park had opened in 1955 on 160 acres in Anaheim, and it had worked wildly, more than anyone at the studio had predicted. But it had also taught Walt a lesson he didn't enjoy learning. The moment Disneyland became profitable, land around its borders got bought up fast by motel chains, gas stations, souvenir stands, none of it his, all of it riding his name. He had built something and then watched other people build a fence around it made of cheap hotels. He referred to this stretch of Anaheim more than once in language that wasn't fond. He wanted the next one to be different. He wanted enough land around the park that nobody could do to him what Anaheim had done. And that meant buying at a scale nobody in Orlando or Orange County had ever seen from a single company. Starting in 1964, Disney's people bought land in Central Florida through a set of shell companies, Reedy Creek Ranch Corporation, Compass East Corporation, names picked to reveal nothing. Real estate agents don't run background checks on buyers who pay cash and don't ask questions back. And by the time local reporters started connecting the dots, Disney already had more than 27,000 acres, an area roughly twice the size of Manhattan. When the Orlando Sentinel's Emily Bavar published a story in October 1965 titled, "Is Our Mystery Industry Disney?" the paper effectively forced Walt's hand. On October 25, 1965, Florida's governor confirmed at a press conference what Bavar had guessed. A month later, Walt and Roy stood beside the governor in Orlando and made it official. This would not be a second Disneyland. Walt told the room it would be the biggest thing the company had ever attempted. He wasn't exaggerating for effect. What he had in mind for that land went well past a theme park. And this is the part of the story that gets flattened most often in the retelling, because the thing that actually got built in 1971 was not the thing Walt was describing in 1966. He called the real project Epcot, the experimental prototype community of tomorrow. Not a ride, a city. He'd spent years reading about urban planning, visiting new towns being built around the country, growing increasingly irritated by what he saw as the failure of American cities to solve basic problems of transportation, housing, and blight. His answer wasn't a park with a city theme. It was a functioning, populated, climate-controlled city under a dome, with a downtown business core at its center, monorails and people movers doing the work cars did everywhere else, and corporations testing new technology in a place where 20,000 actual residents would live and work. He said, in a film recorded that October, that he didn't think there was a more important challenge facing the country than fixing its cities, and that the only way to do it properly was to start from nothing, on land nobody already lived on. The theme park, what would become the Magic Kingdom, was, in his plan, a secondary feature, an entry point, a way to fund the real project and give visitors somewhere to go before they got to see the actual working city he wanted to build behind it. He never got the chance to build any of it, and the difference between his Epcot and the version that eventually opened in 1982, 16 years after his death, as a permanent exposition-style park rather than a living city, is one of the clearest measures of how much got lost when he died with the plans still in his head and not fully on paper. Roy Disney, who came out of a retirement he'd been easing into, spent the last years of his own life fighting to keep the Florida project alive at all, in whatever form the company could manage without its one person who actually understood the whole shape of it. That's the context for the ceiling. It wasn't idle daydreaming from a dying man. It was the last available surface. Here's what the timeline actually looked like, stripped of the parts that get softened for a documentary pace. In October 1966, Walt scheduled a routine pre-surgery checkup at St. Joseph's Hospital in Burbank, across the street from the studio, close enough that he barely had to leave work to get there, which mattered to him more than it should have. The surgery on the table was for his neck. He'd been in pain for a while, the result of an old polo injury, and doctors wanted to fix a cervical vertebra before it got worse. 2 days after that checkup, on October 27th, he filmed what turned out to be his last television appearance, an episode called An Evening with Walt Disney, in which he talked about an upcoming film called Blackbeard's Ghost and previewed The Happiest Millionaire. In that same broadcast, he mentioned a 15-year-old contract actor named Kurt Russell, predicting he had a real acting future ahead of him. He was right, though not in the way anyone watching that night could have guessed how the story would end. An X-ray taken around that checkup found something on his left lung, roughly the size of a walnut. His wife Lillian told their eldest daughter, Diane, standing in her kitchen doorway, in words that make clear how carefully the news was being managed inside the family even at that stage. A spot on his lung, nothing more specific than that. On November 7th, doctors removed the lung. The surgery was for cancer, but the full severity of the diagnosis was, by most accounts, never spelled out to Walt in plain terms. He seems to have believed, or allowed himself to believe, that he was recovering from something survivable. And he kept working from the hospital bed as if that were true. Reviewing scripts, dictating notes, tracking the 6 films and assorted television projects the studio had in various stages, talking through Florida with anyone who visited. The clearest surviving trace of what was actually on his mind in his last conscious hours isn't the ceiling tiles. It's a piece of paper. Shortly before he was admitted for the final time, Walt typed out a memo. The heading read, "TV projects in production, ready for production or possible for escalation and story." Underneath, in his own handwriting, added with a red grease pencil, were 4 names: Ron Miller, his son-in-law, and a rising studio executive. Two-way down cellar, the title or shorthand for a project in development. Kurt Russell, misspelled, the same young actor from the October broadcast, and CIA Mobley, a notation nobody has ever fully decoded, though the best guess among Disney historians is that it referred to a story property under consideration, not an actual reference to intelligence agencies. Disney historian Jim Korkis has written about this note more than once, and its plainness is what makes it worth mentioning at all. It isn't poetic. It isn't a message to anyone. It's a list a working executive makes at his desk before an ordinary Tuesday, except this Tuesday ended with him checked into St. Joseph's for the last time. There's a persistent version of this story, repeated in enough places that it has its own kind of half-life, claiming Walt's actual last words were Kurt Russell, spoken aloud on his deathbed, a final cryptic message about an actor nobody at the time understood the significance of naming. It isn't true, and Russell himself has pushed back on it directly. He was on a Universal set the day Walt died, filming a Western television episode, not present at the hospital at all. He recalled, in an interview given years later, noticing a commotion off camera, the crew going quiet, and then someone approaching to tell him Walt Disney had died. He remembers the crew being kind to him about it. That's the whole of Kurt Russell's actual connection to December 15th, 1966, a 15-year-old contract player getting the news secondhand on a different studio's lot, the same way most of the country did. The note about future projects and the ceiling tile conversation with Roy sit only about 5 weeks apart, and together they tell you something specific about how Walt Disney approached the end of his life. Whether or not he understood it was the end, he didn't spend that time settling accounts, writing farewells, or reflecting on the shape of what he'd built. He spent it doing the same thing he'd done for 4 decades at a slightly reduced altitude, tracking which contract player might carry a franchise, which vertebra needed fixing before the pain got in his way, which highway would run through which square mile of a state he'd never lived in. Roy's account of the ceiling has Walt confused at times near the end, which lines up with what's medically expected after major thoracic surgery, combined with a body already fighting late-stage cancer. But confusion and clarity weren't opposites for him in that room. He was confused about some things and completely lucid about the monorail route on the same afternoon. Roy Disney's public statement, issued to employees, stockholders, and the press within days of his brother's death, said the plans for the future. New films, the expansion of the California park, the Florida project, a proposed ski development at Mineral King, would continue to move ahead because that was how Walt wanted it. It reads now less like consolation and more like an instruction Roy was giving himself. He was 73 when Walt died and had been talking about stepping back from daily operations. Instead, he stayed for 5 more years, pushed the Florida deal through the Reedy Creek legislation in the Florida State House, and made sure ground broke on the project in 1971 under a name he insisted on personally. Not Disney World, but Walt Disney World because, as he told a crowd afterward, everyone remembers the Ford car and forgets it was Henry Ford who built the company. He wanted his brother's name attached permanently to the one part of it that would outlast either of them. The company's stock rose about 10 points in the days after Walt's death, on rumors, never substantiated, that a larger corporation might move to acquire it now that its founder was gone. It didn't happen. What happened instead was slower and less clean. A company trying to execute a decade of half-finished, half-verbalized ambition from a man who had never written most of it down in a form anyone else could fully use. Walt Disney had never held an official corporate title at the studio that bore his name. His brother Roy was technically the company's president and, later, chairman, which meant that when Walt died, the studio didn't just lose a chief executive. It lost the one person whose head contained the plans that hadn't yet made it onto paper, blueprints, or contracts. Everyone else was left reconstructing intent from notes, from memos, from what people remembered him saying in meetings and, however imperfectly, however much later gets simplified into legend, from what he'd traced across a ceiling with his finger. In the last days, he had it to point with.